say, you know, on the one hand, we have very bad news from Australia. On the other hand, we have good news from Australia. Two distinguished, you know, professors from Australia talking about the geopolitics in Southeast Asia and Australian perspective. We all know, you know, Rory Medcalf. He used to work with the Rory. Prior to that, we used to work with the Australian Foreign Ministry, and we have known each other by some time. And also, we have, you know, Medcalf, Sussex, you know, he's working with, you know, Rory at Australian National University. Rory is heading the National Security Colleges, and, you know, new college, kinds of our Korean diplomatic academy. They train the diplomats, you know, defense, you know, officials, as well as, you know, intelligence officers. He used to work for the Office of National Australia. Intelligence analysis broad. In fact, I gave a talk there about 2 years ago. Very lively community. And as I told you, you know, are you going to make a joint presentation?
I'll speak and Matt will speak. We'll share the work.
Then you have 30 minutes, and then after that, also you have 30 minutes. After that, and I'll invite John to make a quick 5-minute comment, and then I'll open the floor. Okay? Okay, Paula.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I suspect we might each take probably about 20 minutes and give more time for discussion, because I know there are a much wider range of issues to discuss than the themes that we've got today. But look, I really want to thank you personally for hosting us. I admire and respect your work, and I think the work of this foundation and the Global Asia magazine, which I'm an avid reader of, is really important to broadening the debate and maintaining the quality of the policy and analytical debate in Asia, and this is noticed in Australia, I assure you. I will also say one or two things, I think, to begin with about where my colleague, Associate Professor Sussex, and I fit into the community of scholars and experts and analysts in Australia that was in the region, and the fact that our college is quite a new player on the scene, but part of a very established institution, the ANU, adding, I think, more diverse and independent voices to the debate. I know that we're going to speak about, Northeast Asia as a global centre of gravity. Personally, I want to position that within a wider Asian framework, and it doesn't matter in a way how you define that, whether you call it the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific or something else. But I think it's part of the global significance of what's happening here on the Korean Peninsula, what's happening in Northeast Asia more generally, is precisely because the economies and the societies in this part of the world are now so connected in a global system, and a global system where I think global order is under strain. So I'll position it there. I know that it's challenging timing for us in a way to be speaking about long-term challenges of regional and global order in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, when you have obviously an immediate event on the peninsula that's going to take a lot of attention. So I don't have a natural link or segue from what I have to say today to what's just happened on the other side of the demilitarised zone. But I think in the Q&A we'll inevitably come to that. So, all right, I'll start off with a little bit more then about some background about, and of course Matt will introduce himself shortly, but just to explain to you a little bit more about how my college fits into the policy debate in Australia. So as we've just heard, the National Security College is quite a new player in the scene in Australia. Many of you are familiar with the Australian National University. Where we're a little bit different is that the college was established very much as a partnership between the Australian government and the university. Quite recently, in fact, under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who many of you would be familiar with. And within the Australian debate, of course, I believe you've got something wrong and you've got something right. I think the establishment of the National Security College was one of the things we got right. So our mission is to really improve and lift the quality of thinking and policy making and practice among the Australian national security community, very broadly defined, including diplomats, absolutely, also including officials, police, analysts and so forth, but also reaching into the private sector and into wider society. I think it's recognised now that national security is no longer something that can be left to government alone, and so we engage very much with the private sector and increasingly with international partners. And certainly the Republic of Korea is on the list of important international partners we want to engage with. We have an academic program, we do short courses for government officials, but we also have a very active policy engagement and research program, and it's really in that spirit that I'm very pleased to engage with you today. And just to emphasise, our academic program is very much independent of government, so we have the luxury in a way of being supported by government, but doing so with independent voices. So that's us. An Australian perspective, and I know that Korean perspectives are listed above as well, and of course it won't be for me or my colleague to offer you a Korean perspective, but we look forward to hearing, I hope, many Korean perspectives. An Australian perspective on the idea of a regional or global centre of gravity. I think that it's fair to say that over the past 10 years or so, Australia's perspective has shifted, it has changed, it's still in the process of change. It is driven by many things. Firstly, the changing patterns of economic relationships, economic networks and dependence in the region. Not only the rise of China, but also the emergence of a number of significant powers in Asia, broadly defined, with which Australia is developing very profound trading, investment, diplomatic and political relationships, and indeed societal relationships. I think it's really important for us to remember that Australia has always been a nation of migrants, and these days, of course, it's quite astounding to think there's been in Australia's major cities at least 1/3 of the population was born in another country. So Australia's engagement with Asia now has a deeply human face as well as an economic and a strategic dimension. And so this Australian perspective on a regional centre of gravity has changed in the past decade, partly through a recognition of the importance of deep engagement with China, sustained engagement with other partners in the region, including Japan, including the Republic of Korea, deep trading relationships that were built up over many, many years. Broader engagement with Southeast Asia. It's interesting that the Australia-Indonesia relationship, always a difficult one for us, nonetheless, it is a broadly positive relationship. Now, you won't find any of the negativity or suspicion about the Indonesia relationship that you would have encountered in Australia 20 years ago or more. And all of this positioned in a much wider regional context. Now, I have a background as an India specialist and worked in India, in particular with the Australian government over the years. And I find it fascinating that a lot of the engagement now of East Asian economies and East Asian societies with South Asia and beyond really has an Indian Ocean dimension and a dimension of engagement with India. Whether it's the fact that energy security is so acutely reliant on the Indian Ocean and will continue to be, I think, for major trading economies in this part of the world. Whether it's the fact that if you're looking forward rather than looking backwards, I think we have no choice but to try to bring India into the global economic investment increasingly, and I think India has been seen as a potential venue for all sorts of economic partnerships, manufacturing, services and so on. It's a difficult country in many ways to deal with, but of course the major economy now that's growing at a really, really healthy rate. Or whether it's the fact that, and I think this is crucial to where I'll get deeper into the maritime side of the conversation, but whether it's the fact that in fact China's own perspective on the region, China's own relations with a wider Asia are now in significant part mediated through the prism of the One Belt, One Road initiative, which has a land dimension, of course, through Eurasia, and that is a Russia and Central Asia person, so he'll tell you more about that, I'm sure, but whether it has a maritime dimension, a maritime Silk Road, which in my own opinion is still probably going to be more important for China's energy security in the long run. So Australia's idea that Northeast Asia remains an absolutely crucial centre of gravity for us because our top three trading relationships essentially are here, or often the top three out of our top 5. I know that this Australian ambassador will tell me the numbers keep shifting somewhat, but China, Japan and the Republic of Korea are consistently among our top 3 relationships, all concentrated here. A lot of the strategic challenges of our wider strategic environment are focused here. The interests of the United States, our ally, the interests of our key trading partners all engaged here. That's where what happens on the Korean Peninsula does matter intensely to Australia, quite apart from the impacts on the non-proliferation order and global order more generally. Australia really can't turn its back on what happens in this part of the world. But I do think that we're seeing a significant shift in Australian policy thinking in recent years to position Northeast Asia within an Indo-Pacific framework that captures both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, that focuses on the linkages between East Asia and other parts of the world through South Asia, through the Indian Ocean. I don't think that's going to go away. So the fact that we're now trying to come to terms as a nation with what are China's interests and activities and presence in the Indian Ocean going to look like. China has legitimate interests in the Indian Ocean, but how it pursues those interests, whether it does so unilaterally or cooperatively, will have a huge impact on how others respond, including how the Indians respond, how the United States responds, how we respond, how Indonesia responds, and so forth. We also are looking, I guess, at how other East Asian countries are beginning to engage across a wider theatre. Now, it's interesting, in this room, I to observe that Japan's been increasingly engaged across the Indo-Pacific for its own reasons, partly, I think, defensive or anxious reasons related to the rise of China, partly also because I think there is obviously a changing strategic mindset in Japan. I get mixed signals about how interested Korea is in a wider conception of Asia, or whether because you have such acute problems in the immediate neighbourhood, you have this challenge that we do not envy of what to do about North Korea, how to I guess manage tension and move towards some sort of positive resolution, whether that's going to really maintain focus and really eat up a lot of Seoul's attention in the years to come. If you look at some of the statistics, I guess, I think there's plenty of data out there about how dependent this country is on oil across the Indian Ocean, oil from key suppliers in the Middle East and in Africa. I think something like 95% of oil imports come that way from this country. That's actually even more acute than China's dependence, more acute than Japan's dependence. I think it's a really difficult challenge for you to deal with, and I think my own perspective from an Australian middle power point of view is very much that we can't do this alone. I was involved with the drafting of the Australian Defence White Paper this year, which I think, and I would say this was I think quite a considered and credible document. It certainly was a result of a lot of process, but I think for the first time Australia produced a Defence White Paper that sought to combine strategic interests with strategic objectives and with the resources, or at least a clear path towards government providing the resources to build the partnerships and capabilities we need. A really important theme in that white paper, apart from the fact that it re-endorsed this idea of the Indo-Pacific, it gave a lot of centrality to North Asia, it positioned North and Northeast Asia within a wider Indo-Pacific framework, within all these relationships that I've mentioned. An important characteristic also was the absolute premium that it placed on security partnerships, and made absolutely explicit that military power cannot protect and advance its interests alone. And I think if you look at the list of partnerships that the Australian Defence White Paper spelled out, the Republic of Korea was pretty significant on that list. There were some predictable names on there. Of course, the alliance with the United States remains central at this stage to the way Australia perceives its security interests and partnerships. And I think it's very, very hard to imagine Australian security without the US alliance, and we're all very hopeful that we never will have to imagine that. But there is also, I think, quite a healthy idea about diversifying security partnerships in Australia. So the relationship that's been built with this country, 2+2 dialogue, the various declarations and improved arrangements in the past 6 years or so, I think is quite a significant priority in Canberra. But looking beyond bilateralism, I think the white paper also emphasised Japan, it emphasised Indonesia, it emphasised India, it emphasised an interesting range of powers not immediately located in this region. It obviously spoke about China, but it also spoke about countries like France, it spoke about European partners. It took a global focus, recognising that, to return to our theme, that an Indo-Pacific conception of Asia, the linkages between East Asia and South Asia, to Europe, to the Middle East, to Africa, if that is the global centre of gravity, if challenges to stability and order in this region, whether it's challenges at sea, maritime challenges in the South China Sea, whether it's challenges in interstate relations on land, for example, around threats of war or nuclear proliferation. These are no longer the preserve of individual states or local states alone in our region. So I think the concluding point that the white paper got to, as well as quite an ambitious plan for Australia's naval and wider defence modernisation, was really a greater emphasis on building a really creative range of partnerships to deal with these threats and challenges. And I would argue that the three key powers in Northeast Asia are very much part of that plan, that frame of reference. A lot is going to depend now on how a middle power like Australia, with limited resources and limited diplomatic attention, can engage a partner like Korea in looking not only to localised challenges, but to the wider regional challenges, whether it's maritime security, whether it's counter-piracy, whether it's managing threats to natural resources, fish stocks and so forth, whether it's being willing to collaborate on stabilisation operations if our nationals get into trouble in third countries, for example, in Africa, the Middle East and South Asia, or whether it's indeed how do we deal with proliferation. And I guess to end on 2 points, I want to talk a little bit more about maritime and a little bit more about nuclear before I wrap up. On the maritime side of things, and I spoke this morning at the Seoul Defence Dialogue on some of this material, so if any of you were there, please excuse the repetition. But on maritime security, I think whatever position you take on territorial claims, whatever position you take on, for example, China's claims in the South China Sea in particular, and its assertion of a historical right, as opposed to the view of the very clear finding of the permanent court of arbitration that China's historical rights have been extremely overstated in the South China Sea and very many ways at odds with UNCLOS. I think we can all agree that in this interconnected region where our economies are so dependent on maritime commerce, and in that sense, I think this country is an island, just like Australia is an island. We need to do everything we can to maintain order at sea, to maintain predictability in the way that navies and coast guards and air forces are relating to one another at sea. So I think that if I was sitting here looking at the region, as well as looking at the big challenges over DMZ, and I think today's exactly the wrong day for me to be saying this. But if I were looking in the long term from a Korean perspective, I would see that any effort to build middle power coalitions and interests, middle power diplomatic corpuses, middle power efforts to use multilateral organisations like the ADMM plus Asia, Defence Ministers Meeting Plus, or indeed the East Asia Summit, are very, very deeply in your interests. But I appreciate that it's hard to allocate time and resources to that when you've got pressing challenges close to home. I think the flip side of that, one of the reasons why I think it precisely will help deal in the long run with the problem of Korea is, and the challenges there, is that the more that you work with other middle powers on wider issues of regional global order, I think the stronger your case will be to engage them with their support in efforts, whether they're diplomatic efforts, whether they're more assertive efforts to manage problems on the Korean Peninsula. So I think there is a bit of a quid pro quo there, particularly if you're looking now, for example, to Europe, which has its own security challenges. Again, a personal perspective from Australia, it's going to get in some ways more difficult to engage Europe as partner on a lot of global issues unless we're willing to collaborate on issues that matter to Europe. So I think likewise on regional security, the more that middle powers can be like-minded on maintaining good order at sea, the more chance we've got to be able to call on one another for our own security problems. The last point I'll make, before I go to Matt for some opening remarks, is on the nuclear side of things and on the wider non-proliferation regime. I think that I fully appreciate the perspective that we cannot see what's happened today, apparently, in North Korea as being purely about nuclear non-proliferation or purely about nuclear arms control. There's a much deeper geostrategic context there that we have to deal with. But I do think that really, when you look at global arms control in the past few decades, we've had a bit of an unsung success story in a way, and that is that so few countries, in fact, have turned to nuclear proliferation and developing nuclear weapons. So I think we have to be realistic about our ambitions to roll back what's happening in North Korea, our ambitions to roll back what's happening anywhere else for that matter. I think there's still some very unrealistic language around about India and Pakistan, for example. Having said that, I think that, again, to really maintain international consensus and support on these issues, it makes a lot of sense for countries in this region, particularly for this country, to be active as a global player on proliferation issues and other issues where your interests do not appear to be immediately engaged, immediately concerned, to be seen as a global player and a global citizen. I think that there's obviously going to be a very frustrating period ahead, and I don't think anyone can pretend that the coincidence, and I use that word perhaps ironically, of what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, of what's happening in the South China Sea, of what's happening in the Middle East, of what's happening in Europe, of what's happening within the United States election, is such a difficult coincidence in the world, because I think there are so many simultaneous threats to order that it's going to be very hard to expect the international community to marshal its resources against any single one of these threats consistently at any given time. Attention is going to be either very brief and very distracted, or diffuse and spread across all of these challenges. And I think certainly, I suspect the view from Washington would be something like that. So again, I think the more that a middle power like Korea can work with other middle powers like Australia to do common cause and some of these other threats and challenges, the more potential you're going to be able to have to enlist fellow middle powers to achieve some kind of diplomatic breakthrough on the Korean Peninsula. I'll stop there. Very happy to answer questions, but I wanted to give you, I think, a slightly refreshed snapshot of a personal Australian perspective, which may not be consistent with the worldview from this part of the world, but I think is really valuable to hear. And I should just finish by saying we need to hear more Korean voices in Australia on these issues. So there's a standing invitation to colleagues in the room to come and speak at my college on those issues.
Thank you. Matthew, do you want to jump?
Certainly. Thank you very much, yes. And thank you, Professor Moody, for the very kind invitation to come here and be the support act to Rory Medcalf, because he's far more erudite than I am when it comes to these matters. I must confess to having come up with the suggestion for the topic, and a little bit cheeky as well, because I thought, well, of course the Koreans are going to think that Northeast Asia is the geopolitical centre of gravity. But the interesting thing is that much of scholarship in Australia would have it this way as well, and would have done so since the 1990s. I remember as an undergraduate student learning that Northeast Asia was where the action was in terms of the major security dilemmas that can be found in Asia. What's interesting is, however, I don't necessarily think those security dilemmas have yet have been activated until rather recently. We are seeing a situation within the Northeast Asian geopolitical context, I think, where you're now getting those types of major power overlays in terms of security competition, where previously the major powers have tried very hard to stay out of it, or at the very least have attempted to prevent their other interests from getting involved. So whereas the European Union, whereas the United States, whereas Japan, whereas China, all I think tried to play very constructive roles within Northeast Asia. Now we're starting to see other things enter in, which have the potential to problematise security affairs to a significant extent. Let me go back to sort of seeing ourselves at the centre of the world. It's kind of logical and natural that we do. Korean perspective, and people to the map for where the most important geopolitical activity is, would have the Korean Peninsula, I would have thought, right in the middle. Now Australia has had both a similar and a different experience in that it has seen itself for many, many years as being a sort of relative geostrategic backwater, protected by virtue of distance, separation from these major types of security domains, but increasingly becoming more and more important. So Australia has broadened its approach, if you like, to understanding security in the region. And it's a process that began really in the 1970s and 1980s when Australia began to just first start to encounter Asia as a trading partner, having in previous years had slightly less than exemplary record when it came to dealing with Asian countries. But particularly from the late 1980s, early 1990s, Australian policymakers adopted a very similar approach, I suppose, which put Australia at the centre of regional concerns. And Gareth Evans is an excellent example here. In fact, he's the main architect, who happens to be the Australian National University's Chancellor, and also well known to many people from the Korean audience. It's Australia's former foreign minister. Now, he used to walk into meetings in ASEAN with new maps of the world and say that here is East Asia, and guess what? If you tilt it on its axis, Australia is right in the middle of East Asia. So Australia is at the centre of the action. Was this true? No. And it was predominantly used for rhetorical purposes to say, to try and sponsor Australia's push into an Asia-Pacific region. And varying countries bought it or didn't buy it to varying degrees. The dominant consensus seemed to be, sure, we'll trade with Australia, but it's not necessarily part of the region. Why does this matter in terms of the way we understand geopolitics? Well, I think it matters because of the thing I alluded to before, which is that the extent to which major power overlays in particular are starting to reshape security concerns and security agendas. Let me go back to the Korean context, where, of course, recently you've had THAAD as an issue, which has vexed a wide array of regional players, but seen as necessary very much for Korean security, and the Americans see it as a necessary response to North Korea. But it has triggered a round of, I don't want to sound too flippant, but I've said this to my students, air defense bingo, where you establish, China establishes a new air defense army in its northeast, the Russians establish a new air defense army as well. The Russians look forward to selling S-400 missiles to the Chinese to ensure that they continue to make some kind of commercial advantage out of it. And so this starts becoming reflective again of broader major power issues rather than something that's targeted specifically at the North Korean problem or the North Korean issue. You also have increased interest by countries which previously had professed to have interest, but in practice really didn't exercise very much. And I'm speaking, of course, of the Russian Federation. Now, Russia was more or less, during the six-party talks, an invisible actor. In fact, has been an invisible actor in Asia for quite some time, until very recently. Putin decides in 2012, 2013, that the major nation-building task facing the Russian Federation is going to be this secondary pivot, this Russian pivot to Asia. And the Russians have said so before, and they haven't had the capacity to follow through on it. But this time it appears at least that they're serious, or that they're going to give it a really serious try. And one of the manifestations, of course, is the increased contact between Korea and the Russian Federation. Just produced. Lots and lots of visits, if not lots of visits, lots of bilateral agreements signed, lots of companies which would be joint Korean-Russian set up to do all sorts of things, from maritime transport to heavy industry cooperation. Of course, the Russians are very interested in energy as well. So you have Russia starting to become more of a player in the region. In other words, I think that the security environment within this very important geopolitical space of Northeast Asia, the security environment is actually tightening. But it's a security environment that is tightening at a point where Korea, I think, is going to find it more difficult to control, manage, guide regional affairs. And I think, in a way, Australia and Korea are somewhat similar in that they find themselves in regions with, or sub-regions, with security challenges that they worry that they can't necessarily control. They worry that future developments will make it difficult for them to control. The interesting thing, of course, is the role of China in all this. And China, I think, laying aside South China Sea for the moment, China, I think, is still managing to quite effectively burden shift when it comes to security. It burden shifts in three places. It burden shifts on the one hand in Central Asia, where it says to the Russian Federation, okay, you manage security affairs for Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. We will invest large amounts of money and we will generate heavy economic interdependence, which could, you take away the you've got dependence and you also have a fair bit of economic control. But Russia picks up the security bill for the management of security in Central Asia. A lot of the scholarship, and again, I'm sorry for focusing on Russia, but it's my area of expertise, so I would be churlish if I didn't. A lot of the scholarship on Russia says that Russia seeks for itself a sphere of influence, a buffer zone between itself and NATO. Well, if you're China, your buffer zone is in fact the Russian Federation. It's in fact 9 time zones at least. So it manages to sheet again a security burden or potential security burden that otherwise it would have to devote resources to. And of course to the east, I think the Chinese are able to say to the United States, without any grand bargain for how to manage security affairs within East Asia, they're more or less able to say to the United States, well, look, you'll de facto accept that you are the dominant military security actor in the region. That doesn't stop us internally balancing against you and undertaking military modernisation campaigns so that one day we become a challenge. But effectively it drains the United States of security resources. In all this type of milieu, Korea finds it, I think it will find it, a security environment that is both tightening but also broadening. Let me reflect a little bit from the Australian experience to demonstrate what I'm saying. Australia sees its own security region as having broadened rather than tightened. I mentioned Gareth Evans talking about moving from a Southeast Asian conception of where Australia might fit. Before that, of course, Australia sort of loosely referred to itself as being near the South Pacific and the so-called arc of instability. This is a common phrase used in Australian diplomatic circles. There was an arc of instability that stretched from Indonesia down through Papua New Guinea and took in a variety of Pacific Island nations. The implication being that Australia had special rights, special responsibilities, special duties perhaps, to help manage security affairs in that area. And that's broadened out to a Southeast Asian conception, it's broadened out to an East Asian conception, to an Asia-Pacific one, and now, partly thanks to my boss, who managed to coin a phrase, and of course his talents extend far beyond just coining a phrase, but the phrase he coined was Indo-Pacific. It's a way to conceptualise Australia's place in the world, and based on the very logical, as far as I can tell, observation that Australia has real estate or ocean real estate on 2 great big oceans, that if you look at global trade flows, increasingly a 2 oceans concept is going to be vital to understand where goods and services are going to go, and that regardless of whether it's one belt, one road, or whether it's established trade links that are going to be the main path of the main transit points for goods and services, you have to have an appreciation of Indian strategic environment, or Indian Ocean strategic environment, in addition to a Pacific one. So, what types of lessons can we learn from this, if anything? The trick is, I think, to say something that is meaningful but manageable, and not completely meaningless. And I think it's strange that Australia, on the one hand, I think it's strange that Australia and Korea have, to an extent, struggled to come up with things that they can learn from one another. And I think much of the reason for that is because of the tight focus of the Korean foreign and security policy community, and because of the very broad ambit focus of the Australian foreign and security policy community. But nonetheless, there are plenty of things that Korea and Australia have in common. They're both middle powers. They both face increasing reliance on Chinese markets. They are both American security allies, and would probably, especially after the events of today, would appreciate as many comments from the United States about their continued commitment to the region in order to shore up insecurities. But both of them also face, I think, the potential for a lessened United States presence in the region in the future. How we manage that, how we navigate that, is quite a challenge. So I think Australia can learn something from Korea about security dilemmas that are concentrated, that are tight, because Korea has been dealing with this for a very, very long time. By the same token, I think that perhaps Korea can learn something from Australia about security dilemmas that are diffuse. What does that mean in practice? Well, I think that the changing nature of geopolitics within the close sub-region of Northeast Asia and the broader region of the, let's call it the Indo-Pacific for argument's sake, is definitely going to lead both of our countries out of their respective comfort zones. I'm not saying that having a neighbour a few kilometres to your north detonating large nuclear weapons is necessarily comfortable. But nonetheless, I think that increasingly Korea is going to have to take a broader focus, and Australia is going to have to be able to adopt narrower focuses on choke points like the Malacca Straits and so forth. So it's going to have to adjust its frame of reference accordingly as well. Ultimately, things like energy security, maritime security, freedom of navigation, the rise of India, the potential, as I've said, for a slightly lessened US presence within the region in the future, and I think also a rules-based order where there are multiple sources of rules, all things that are going to affect our ability to cooperate with one another, and also the types of forums in which we shop. And I think the rules-based order one is increasingly important, because whereas after the Cold War ended, there was really only one game in town, and that was Western democratic universalism, so-called end of history. Now there are increasing alternatives for understanding what a rules-based order might look like, for understanding what international law might look like. And that's whether it's international law based on maritime issues, freedom of navigation, freedom of the North Sea, or whether it is international law surrounding the proper conduct of states, whether they're engaging in trade activities, or military security cooperation, or respect for territorial integrity, and so on. All those are going to have knock-on effects for both Korea and Australia. So I think on a broad level, there is plenty of scope for cooperation between the two countries. I'm not saying that we don't cooperate, of course. We cooperate an enormous amount. There's a large amount of trade. We are very privileged to have to host, I think it's 27,000 Korean students in Australia. The more the merrier, in fact. If you want to come and study in Australia, I'd be quite happy to give you a booklet to advertise our programs. But I think we can do more, and I think it's imperative that we do try and do more, and hopefully that our discussions around the table might help contribute towards that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Will you give us just less than 5-minute comments?
Yeah, I think 5 minutes is long enough. I met Rory and Matthew this morning. We had a relation, basically on how we link up with each other, construct, as just mentioned, working level relationship, because I think I work pretty well with the group of people. And also, I confession that I went to high school in Australia. So I'm sort of, whatever I am, essentially begin with, Australia experience. I took about 3 years, and I really finished my experience. Anyway, I think that Australia presents Korea with a lot of puzzles and a lot of opportunities. Puzzle being is that, basically one of the things that Australian academic community presented to international relations community here is the concept of middle power. And with that, basically Australia was trying to get into the so-called marketplace, intelligent marketplace here in Asia. And I think that truly, if you somehow approach with measurement issue, basically perhaps Korea would fit into the category of middle power, however you define it, because we have Japan, obviously not a middle power, but they wanted to be middle power, but with a heavyweight. But also China is obviously not a middle power, it's a rising power, and America is obviously not a middle power. But I think that, there are a couple of things, agendas that we can work together, because we always talk about middle power, we don't know how to define it. Basically how do you conceptualize it, and how do you essentially operationalize it? What will be the impact of middle power? Otherwise, it becomes sort of a self-promoting issues that nobody essentially pay attention to. Having said that, this is a suggestion and also things that we can work together. Basically, what's the middle power and where can we learn from it? And obviously, Swedish ambassadors here, when I always make fun of when I'm little kids and drunk with my Australian friends, that how can you not be why don't you be Asia Pacific Sweden? Be more neutral, be more participant, and be much more well receptive to people, because I think the geographic location of Australia is now very much blessing, because we're essentially down under and essentially far from most of the people here. Yet you are very much a democratic state with a global value that we can essentially pay respect to. But sometimes I think that Australians are, respectfully speaking, sometimes Australia is much more behaving like little America here.
Which is true.
Yeah, I'm just going to
Just be frank, be honest.
So you try to promote the middle power concept, but you have a very strong relationship with America. Then how does it work together? In other words, how does Australia's alliance with the United States affect your vision to be a true middle power? And also, one other contribution that Australia made was the concept of Asia Pacific. Obviously, basically, you broaden our concept of the region itself. Sometimes we try to locate ourselves in Northeast Asia, because more time we interchangeably use the term Asia Pacific. I think that that's a great contribution that you guys made to Korea community as well. But going back to Matthew's point, the security environment is tightening and bad for Korea, which I totally understand. But does it really matter to Australia if our security in the Korean Peninsula goes really, really bad? But how does it affect Australia's threat perception, as well as your interest here? I think that if I'm not mistaken, Australia is one of the very few countries in Asia that has dual ambassadorship, the relationship with North Korea. Then how come we don't see much of Australian activities on the scene? Are you essentially, respectfully again, sitting very idle by, essentially promoting, alliance value? Then how does then again affect your rhetorical promotion being middle power?
Can I ask you to clarify what you mean by promoting alliance failure?
Your pardon?
You said promoting alliance failure.
No.
Sorry.
No. So what I'm saying is basically, you have two good agendas. I think that's very good. Promoting the Asia Pacific concept, which essentially coincides with your broadened regional concept, right? But yet, you're essentially also promoting the middle power and basically a lot of program, multilateral, rule-based, or norm-based, and whatever. But then you bring in alliance. Because some of the states in Asia may not be really fond of it. So then that's sort of the question that I always have to Australian friends. But I think that, your college looks pretty good. I think, we would love to very much work with you. And I think that, this would be a good stepping stone. Thank you very much.
Okay, now open to the floor. Yes, Mr. Kim.
One issue neither of you mentioned is the issue of ISIS created by. Although Asia is not suffering as much as Europe, Asia is the largest Muslim nation in the world, it's just